Hello, I'm Annie Davey. I've been telling Bible stories to children for many years, and I've got some lovely ones to tell you from the New Testament in this section here. If you want to know about the background, where I got some of the background detail from, you can look it up on the web on truthortradition.com or www.korky.info, where we've written a book called Jesus, Faith and Fact. So it's all in there somewhere, but there's some interesting things here which you may not know. You may think you do know the stories, but wait and see. So let's see what we've got. Hello. Well, here we are with another lovely story. This time it's from the book of Matthew, the first of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. And the thing about the Gospels is that they're all a little bit different, but the legal people say that that's shows how true they are, because if you have a case of law when somebody's in court and you have witnesses, they'll all tell the story from a slightly different angle. If you get people telling exactly the same story without a word of difference, then you think, something suspicious here. They must have made it up. They must have learned a script. But in the Gospels, we have a slightly different angle on all sorts of things, little bits and bobs that people remembered about Jesus. So it was really important to get it right. And I think most, if not all, of the Bible stories that we have in the Gospels had to be witnessed by 2 or 3 witnesses. Somebody had to be there with Jesus while it happened and say, yes, I was there, I saw this. And John wrote in a letter at the end of the Gospels, in one of his letters, he wrote, "These things which we have seen and heard, we're writing for you, so that you may know and understand." So this is really the truth. Otherwise I wouldn't bother to tell you. And here we've got a little bit of a representation of Capernaum, which was a city on the big lake of Galilee, which was a huge, great long lake. And you know that Jesus' friends, a couple of them anyway, were fishermen, 4 of them at least. And so they knew all about that lake. They knew it from start to finish. And they knew all about fishing. And they were very keen to learn everything that Jesus wanted them to know. Now one day they'd come to Capernaum and it was about Passover time, and that was a time of the year when important and learned men, people who weren't rabbis but who knew a lot about the law and the Jewish traditions, they would be sent out from Jerusalem to collect the taxes. Now taxes is money that you pay to the government to keep things running. The Romans wanted lots of money from them, because they wanted to provide bread and circuses, they said, for the population of the people that they ruled over, particularly Italy. You might remember that in the Old Testament there were 12 tribes of Israel, 12 families, all with different names, and when it came to dividing up the land, they divided it up between 11 of them, and they said that one tribe, the tribe of Levi, who were known as the Levites, weren't given any land, and all the others had to pay 1/10 of everything they had to the Levites to help them keep going, because the Levites' job was to work in the temple, and they had to prepare the sacrifices, to read the law, to teach people about God, to hold the services, and to make sure that all the customs like Passover and the shelters and the Festival of Lights, all those festivals had to be kept. And so the Levites, the family of those, took turns as priests in the temple. Nobody else from the other tribes was allowed to do that, just the Levites. And so the Levites were supported by the temple tax, Jewish tax called a stater. And the stater had to be paid once a year by the people who were collecting for the temple. And nobody really minded paying that, because that was the Jewish law. They didn't like paying for the Roman law at all, obviously, but it had to be done. So when they got to Jerusalem this time, Jesus and the disciples were obviously there, the group of them, and these important men had come, and they said to Peter, they didn't quite like to ask Jesus himself. They knew of him as a rabbi, but they weren't quite sure of his position, of his status, whether he really was or not. So they said to Peter, does your master pay the temple tax? And so Peter, always impulsive, he said, of course he does. So they said, right, then we'd like it, please. Well, Peter went back to the house, and it wasn't polite for him to raise the matter with Jesus, but Jesus knew what had happened. And he said to Peter, "Tell me, Peter, does the king's family have to pay taxes or just his subjects?" So Peter said, "Well, only the subjects, of course. No point in the king's family paying tax if it's to keep them anyway." And so Jesus said, "Yes, exactly." And I said, "We've got a problem here, because these dear men have come and been told to collect the temple tax, and they've been told to ask us for it." But he said, "I'm a rabbi, and as my followers, you and I are not due to pay the temple tax. We don't legally have to do it. And we can't pay for it out of the common purse which Judas held, because that would be what's called misappropriation of funds. That would be using the money wrongly. That's use it for us to use for food and drink and for keeping ourselves. But it's got to be paid. Otherwise, when these dear men go back to Jerusalem and say, we couldn't get Jesus to pay the tax, they're going to be in big trouble, and we might be in big trouble in Capernaum while they sort it out. So the best thing's going to be if we pay the tax." So he said, "What I'd like you to do is to go down to the lake." So here we've got this story about Jesus and Peter. Now, in the lake in Galilee, in East Africa, in the sea as well, in the shallows, there are great big fish called catfish. You can see they've got whiskers. They've got 4 pairs of strong whiskers, and they sort of feel their way around the bottom of the sea with it, on the seabed with it. And they grow up to 1 metre long. They can be very big. And they go for rubbish. They like picking up things that are bright. And so it would be quite normal for them to pick up something on the seabed that looked bright and interesting. But Jewish people were not allowed to eat them because they didn't have scales. That's one of the rules of their food laws, that they mustn't eat fish that didn't have scales on. So they were not really very nice fish. We can eat them nowadays. It's perfectly safe to eat them. But in the Jewish law, they were not to be eaten. So Peter knew that Jesus would have nothing that wasn't anything to do with the truth. Jesus actually said, didn't he, that he is the way, the truth, and the life, and that nobody comes to the Father God except through Jesus. So it was a big thing for Jesus to always be sure to be telling the truth and being the truth. And you know, if we don't tell the truth, we get into trouble, don't we? And sometimes you'll think, well, I'm not going to quite actually say exactly what happened because I might get into trouble. And then the more you make up, the more difficult it becomes to get yourself out of it. And really, it's much better just to own up straight away. Well, there'll be this word here. Which would you rather have, truth or trouble? I know, I'd rather have truth, and sometimes it's difficult to tell it, isn't it? But with this story here, Jesus told Peter to go down to the lake and to throw in a line. Here's Peter. Do you ever go fishing? Throw in a line, and he says you'll catch a big fish. And the big fish that he might have caught would be a catfish. And in the mouth of the fish, Jesus said, you will find a stater. And the stater was a silver coin, a bit like this, And if it had fallen into the lake, it didn't belong to anybody. In the fish's mouth, it couldn't have been more lost, could it? So if Peter found it, he could keep it. So here's the stater, which was probably inside the mouth of the big catfish. But we don't know that he did do that, because he was on his own. So although Matthew's gospel tells us that that's what Jesus told him to do, and pretty surely Peter would have done it, it's not recorded that he did so because of the honesty of the gospel. Now that stater would have been enough to pay the temple tax for Jesus and for Peter. And so it would have been exactly what was needed. And it was a special silver from Tyre. We had a story about Tyre and Sidon, you might remember. And the silver that came from Tyre was really pure. And so they didn't need to add an extra bit, because the Roman shekels were a bit not such good silver. They had something mixed in with them, and so you had to pay a little bit extra with those. But with the Tyre stater, the Tyre shekel, it was just what was needed to pay for the 2 people. So we're told that that's what Jesus told Peter to do, and we can take it as true that that's what actually happened because of this word here. Because of honesty. And that's something which all through the Bible is really, really important. They didn't just tell it as if it was a perfect story about how good everybody was and what brilliant kings they all were. We get the bad stories as well as the good ones. And that's what makes it so believable. Because we know when people got into trouble, we know when people made mistakes. But the good thing is that we know that when they said sorry and really meant it, then God would forgive them and give them a fresh start. That's what I love about it. The truth is absolutely wonderful. And Jesus was the one who told us how important it was. And the Gospels, by all the stories that they show, again underline the fact that they're true. So try and remember that. And try and remember that truth is always better than telling stories and lies and making things up. It won't do. God bless you.